For those of you who have seen the sunrise not long ago, good morning. For those of you who have seen the sunset not long ago, good evening. It is a great pleasure and an honor to welcome you to this new edition of the Ferrate Moral Lectures. We would have liked to celebrate this edition in its usual format, that is, in person and in Girona. But the circumstances, of which you are all very aware, do not allow us to do so. The only consolation on our part is to think that the fact of broadcasting these lectures online makes it easier for us, for some of you at least, to reach many more people than usual. Perhaps thinking, even thinking philosophically, is something inevitable. But not because it is inevitable is it easy. What is certain is that it is not at all easy to discuss complex and full of nuances philosophical questions through a screen. Because if one thing has been demonstrated during this pandemic, it is that thought takes place with others who are present in some way, but above all, bodily. Not only looks, but also the breath encourage us to think, inspire us to think. For all of this, for the challenge of doing these lectures online, I do thank Professor Butler from my heart for accepting to deliver them. Thank you very much. I am also very grateful to Professors Denise Riley, Marina Garcés, Fina Virules, Howard Cagill, and Begoña Saez for agreeing to collaborate as invited scholars in this seminar. One of the great advantages of having invited Judith Butler is that there is no need to waste time in presenting her. You all more or less know her, have read her. However, and as a way of introducing the philosopher who will hold the chair during these next 4 days, I would like to read a brief fragment of the entry that Fina Virules recently wrote for our Ferrate Mora dictionary in its digital version. I think this fragment reflects very well why we were so interested in inviting Judith Butler and why you will all enjoy this seminar so much. I quote, Butler is a restless thinker in the face of violence, exploitation, and subjugation. And in parallel to writing, she has actively participated in social and political movements of contestation. She has been a feminist activist in the gay and lesbian movement, has chaired the International Gay and Lesbian Human Rights Commission, has been involved and participates in anti-war movements, has accompanied occupations such as that of Wall Street, and is very active in her support of the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement, which works to end international support for the occupation of the Palestinian territories and to pressure Israel to respect international law. In Butler, thought and action go together. End of quote. Well, so much for my presentation. If this were a face-to-face seminar, now would be the time for solemnly applaud the beginning of these lectures. We cannot applaud, but I am sure all of us are very happy to be able to attend this seminar. And if we could applaud, we would do so with enthusiasm and great Spinozonian joy. Professor Butler, I give you the floor. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much for the kind and warm introduction. I'm glad to be here, although I must say that it's unclear where here is. And it is also, to some degree, unclear what it is to be glad during these times. But please know, I am most honored to hold this chair and to give these lectures, the Ferrata Mora lectures today and in the next 3 days. My only regret is that I was not able to come there. It was a part of Catalonia that I do not know, and I very much wanted to know. Okay, so to begin, regardless of where we are, and we are, of course, in many places, we live now under a new condition or conditions created by the pandemic. I'm not saying that the pandemic exists outside of other prevailing conditions, but only that the pandemic is a contemporary configuration of prevailing conditions. As such, it is a condition that articulates and intensifies other conditions and cannot be understood apart from them. Environmental destruction, poverty, racism, global inequities, social violence, including violence against women, gender nonconforming people, and sexual minorities. In these pandemic times, some of us are doubtless suffering acute losses, and others may be watching from a safer part of the world, but all of us are living in relation to ambient illness and death. Death and illness are quite literally in the air. However differently we register this pandemic, and what it means to register the pandemic will prove important to what I have to say in the following about the phenomenology of the senses. We do doubtless understand it as global. It implicates us in a world of living creatures whose capacity to affect one another can be a matter of life or death. I am not sure I would say that this is a common world we share, since as much as we might wish to have or to live in a common world, it is more apt to say that there are many and overlapping worlds. Because so many of the major resources of the world are not equitably shared, and there remain those who have a small or vanishing share of the world, we cannot register a global phenomenon, such as the pandemic, without at once registering those inequalities. We sometimes say in English that those with wealth and protection live in a different world than those who do not. Or in Spanish, nosotros vivimos en diferentes mundos. Maybe we ought not to be taken seriously when we speak as if there is a singular world, or when we seek to pluralize the world. What if it remains descriptively true that there are many worlds that are not quite part of that one world, the common world, worlds or maybe zones, perhaps interconnected to some degree with one another, that are outside the common or the commons? Perhaps they do the work for that common world, but are not for that reason of it, or perhaps they are considered the refuse, the waste of the common world, the zone of criminality, black and brown life, migrant life, unmoneyed, in debt, unpayable debt, debt that suffuses life and survives the life of the person. Or maybe we need to think about contiguous and overlapping worlds that are uncommon, or even, as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney maintain, have argued belong to an underlying undercommons. That is a zone of what they call negligence, criminality, but also refuge, experiments in community and art without, usually, sufficient funding. If we do talk about a shared world, we might, with Rancière, talk about the part of those who have no part, those for whom participation in the commons is not possible, or no longer is. If we were to talk about shares of the world, not financial shares, we would have to admit at once that there is no equitable measure for distributing equal shares of the world. We are not just talking about resources and companies in which a share is to be had, but a common world, a sense of the common, a sense of belonging to a world, or of the world as a site of belonging. That is not the same, I think, as a struggle for recognition, but rather it's a way of living life with the assumption that one's life has value, that the world will be structured to facilitate one's flourishing, and that this happens for oneself as it happens for everyone else as well. Without that sense, I do not think we can refer to or register a common world. The pandemic illuminates and intensifies racial inequalities, as we know. A large portion of the pain is clustered in some parts of the subjugated and colonized world and in communities of color. In the United States, Black and brown people are 3 times as likely to become infected with the virus as white people, and twice as likely to die. The statistics, however, cannot explain how it got to be that way, or why it has been accepted within the common world, the existing common world, that the loss of Black life is simply not as worrisome or grievable as the loss of white life. Indeed, face to face with such statistical inequalities, we find ourselves asking, and that's an invitation for you to ask it with me, what kind of world is it in which those statistics are true? What version of reality do these statistics reflect and serve? And what world is circumscribed by the statistics themselves? Yet, even as social and economic inequalities are brought into fuller relief under pandemic conditions, and a vulnerable undercommons of abandonment, fugitivity, and experimental life is exposed, there is also another move, a counter move, in a global direction, one that seems based on a new or renewed sense of mortality, coupled with a political sense of who dies early, and for which set of living beings there exist no safeguards, no infrastructural or social promise of continuity, the sense of a life with the supports it requires to live on. The draw toward a global sense of the world, and let us presume that world and globe are not the same, are not registered in the same way, but that draw is strengthened by, I think, a common immunological predicament, even as it is one that we live out very differently in our different locations. Pandemic is etymologically pandemos, all the people, or perhaps more precisely, the people everywhere, or something that crosses over or spreads over or through the people. The demos is not the citizens of a given state, but all the people despite the legal barriers that seek to separate them. A pandemic operates throughout the world population, but it also afflicts the people as human creatures. The world that is implied is the everywhere, the pan, a world that is threaded together through infection and recovery, by immunity and by fatality. There is no border that stops it from traveling if humans travel, and no social category secures absolute immunity. Indeed, that pretense of power that acts as if it is immune by virtue of its power is actually, as we have seen in my country, the most vulnerable to infection. Or at least we see it now with the waning executive power of the United States. Just a few days, my friends, just a few days. Even though we tend to speak of the world as a singular horizon, or even expect that the word world will set the horizon to experience itself, in other contexts, we surely talk about worlds in the plural. Oddly, we don't generally hear about the worlds of the virus, but we could, or if we did, that would suggest that multiple world horizons are operative, horizons that do not always exactly fuse as Gadamer expected that they would. They would be asynchronous horizons, world limits, as it were, configured through different temporalities. Some have thought that we need to shake this notion of the world and turn to the planetary as a decidedly less anthropocentric category. The planetary can furnish a critical perspective on geographical maps that are invariably geopolitical, whose lines are the accomplishments, for the most part, of those who have vanquished national boundaries usually forged through war and colonization. Achille Mbembe has argued, and I quote, "The political in our time must start from the imperative to reconstruct the world in common," end quote. However, he argues, if we consider the plundering of the Earth's resources for the purposes of corporate profit, privatization, and colonization itself as a planetary project or enterprise, then it makes sense that the true opposition, as it were, the one that does not send us back to our egos and identities, will be a form of decolonization, and here I quote again, which is by definition a planetary enterprise, a radical openness of and to the world, a deep breathing for the world as opposed to insulation. Okay, and this he's writing before the pandemic. A deep breathing for the world as opposed to insulation, or we might say radical immunity. The planetary opposition to extraction and systemic racism ought to then deliver us back to the world, or let the world arrive as if for the first time, one that allows for a deep breathing without fear, a desire we all know now, if we have not already forgotten that desire. I surely hope we have not. There are, of course, many ways to approach this question of the world, including the now complicated debates about world literatures. Sometimes there we find distinctions like European literature and world literature as two options in any given English department. Sorry, it's just... or sometimes it's world literature and English literature and European, so there are three options. But why you would have Spanish and Chinese well, Spanish would be in European, but what about Latin American? They would be with the Chinese, the Russian, and the South Asians, clumped, as it were, in otherness, a form of otherness called the world. Interesting, baffling. And there is also, I would say, the important work of Maria Lugones, decolonial feminist, who in 1987, and I was there, wrote an incredible essay on world traveling, a counter-imperialist account of moving from one world to another's world in order to undergo a transformation in the direction of a more loving perception of alterity. That work is now 33 years old, but addresses readers across the world, underscoring the risk of disorientation in entering another world, another language or epistemic field. The importance of letting one's epistemic field, one's very sense of the limit and structure of the world, become upended and reoriented in the course of an encounter, one in which one becomes willing to suspend or forfeit the coordinates of the world one knows in an effort to reach and apprehend another person or another place. As we know, some insist that the pandemic intensifies all that was already wrong with the world, and others suggest that the pandemic opens us to a new sense of global connection and interdependency. Both propositions are wagers that emerge in the midst of contemporary disorientation. Although I will address those issues in the course of these lectures, my suggestion today is more limited. It is that no matter how located and differentiated the ways that pandemic registers for people across the world, it remains understood as a phenomenon, a force, a crisis, or a condition that extends throughout the world, and that being treated as a condition of the world figures the world in some quite specific ways. In other words, no one, no matter where they are, is not thinking about the world. Although some nations, like my own, have reverted to hyper-nationalist frameworks for understanding the virus, even their efforts to compete with the rest of the world indexes the world in some way, a wretched index for sure. And though some regions seem to have escaped the worst ravages of the coronavirus by chance or have contained its effect through deliberate forms of social conduct, no region is in principle immune. The point is that no region, no bounded entity, indeed no body, is by definition immune in advance, no living body. For a pandemic names a global susceptibility, a potential suffering that belongs to human life in its immunological relationship to the world, one that is part of the world for now, and perhaps for an indefinite period of time. Once it becomes an enduring part of the world, it will shift to something endemic. Interestingly, we don't have a noun for that. We don't refer to the endemic. There is an endemic unleashed on the world. No, a pandemic can be unleashed or spoken about that way, but an illness that has become endemic is part of the fabric of the world, its intermittent suffering. But even if this pandemic fades, the immunological vulnerability will certainly not. And if we hate the virus for the vulnerability it exposes, we ought not for that reason conclude that the absence of the virus will eradicate that vulnerability. It will not. Immunologically considered, the vulnerability foregrounded by the virus is a function of the fact that what is foreign or exogenous is always a part of any organism. We eat, we take in what is foreign to us in order to survive. So the problem is not foreignness. The problem is not, oh, something from China came into our borders, or in Latin America they call it the sopa de Wuhan. No, it's not the virus of that place. It's the virus of every place. So the problem is not foreignness per se, something foreignness enters. Thomas Pradue, who has written a wonderful book on philosophy and immunology called The Limits of the Self, he, according to his view, the problem with the virus would not be that it is foreign, but rather that it is new, and that our immunological systems, or most of ours, have no way to recognize it and fight against it. Pradue is a co-constructionist. His philosophy of science is co-constructionism, and Fausto Sterling, who works on the relationship between sex and gender, is also a co-constructionist, extremely interesting position. The point there is less to distinguish between what properly belongs to the self and what does not, than to understand the immunological problem as an unpreparedness for what is unprecedented. If there were no analogies to other viruses, then the adenovirus vaccines would be declared useless from the start. And RNA vaccines, which seek to mimic the action of the virus, would also be questioned, precisely because they presumed that what is necessary for all viruses, namely to develop an immunological capacity to identify the virus, to react to it, and indeed to fight it. But let us remember that the immune system is not only challenged by what comes from outside, but also from the organism itself, which is why autoimmune attacks of the organism against itself, are very often the consequences of new viral infections. Indeed, one of the great dangers of the present virus is that because we do not know how to fight it, we start to fight, and we fight our own organs. So it becomes um, madly autoimmune in its effects. We attack ourselves because we are looking to attack. We don't know what to attack. I say this because too often the virus is said to come from a foreign place. It's framed within a xenophobic framework. Um, uh, and then, of course, it gets reframed as a question of national security, public national health issues that are damaged by or threatened by the foreign, when in fact, international collaborations, as we know, are our best hope. That seems to me, this worry of the foreignness of the virus, it seems to be an immigration analogy rather than an immunological one. And I underscore this because the organism cannot survive without ingesting foreign elements. We are fundamentally reliant on the foreign in order to live. The world is not just out there as the backdrop for our action, but is on a daily basis incorporated into the body itself. Call me a Lucretian if you must. But we won't be able to understand shared vulnerability and interdependency unless we concede that we pass the air we breathe to one another, that we share the surfaces of the world, and that we cannot touch another without also, in some way, being touched. Today, I want to think about the world through Max Scheler's notion of the tragic. Tomorrow, I will think about breathing, touching, air and surfaces with Merleau-Ponty. On the third day, I will return to the issue of social inequality in order to understand the unequal ways that lives are valued and to suggest that we can understand something important about the present global inequalities we are living with in light of the concept of grievability. Lastly, I will take a look at how feminists have worked with the phenomenological traditions that I reference throughout these lectures and think further about gathering for mourning, for protest, for friendship and solidarity that seems intensified, the crisis that seems intensified under pandemic conditions, but also the possibilities, the new possibilities that are illuminated in this time. So let me approach Max Scheler through an ordinary language example, although he was no ordinary language philosopher. I am struck by how often I hear a question uttered in anguish or surprise. What kind of world is this in which such a thing like this can happen? That may be because I am living in the final moments of the Trump regime that destroys democratic institutions in a daily way, or because my region is subject to massively destructive fires as the result of climate change, or that white supremacists are on the rise, and that all of this happens within the context of a pandemic that continues to surge and strike after relative periods of abeyance. I would suggest that the question, what kind of world is this, seeks to fathom the world in which such a virus can happen. It is not just that the virus is new, as I suggested, but that the world is now exhibited or disclosed as a different sort of world than we once thought it was. The aspect of the world is transformed by the emergence of the virus and its effects. Of course, I would not argue that what emerges now is an altogether new idea of the world, since pandemics have happened before, and the world was always a place where pandemics could and did happen, or it seems so, at least in the centuries that I know about. I'm suggesting only that something about the pandemic makes us take another look at the world as our object of scrutiny, or a matter of analysis. We register the world as a cause for alarm. mark the fact that this version of the world was not anticipated, and register the world suddenly as bearing a new kind of opacity and imposing a new set of limits. When we exclaim in that way, we are asking about the world, taking the world as our object, not sure object is the right word, or see that the world has taken us up in a new way. The world the virus discloses or makes more clearly manifest and unevenly permeates is not only a map or a picture, but something exhibited in the course of viral circulation and its effects. Of course, we may be given graphic pictures of the virus with its blue crown and spikes, and when those representations fill our screens, they stand in for and still a viral condition that they cannot represent. They are closer to the logo of the virus or an advertisement for Disney World or perhaps the Spanish monarchy, right? Like Corona. Why? Why? The pictures function as abbreviated graphic forms that take the virus out of the time of its action and circulate and splash it with color. And though I'm clear that some of the daily graphs and maps which seek to produce a picture of the viral world are very useful, I'm less sure what understanding we receive through the picture of the virus about the world that its pandemic character implies. You may remember that Heidegger claimed that the world picture does not mean a picture of the world, but the world, rather, conceived and grasped as a picture. He raised questions about whether the world could or should be conceived that way, and what it meant that pictures were coming to stand for the world. He pointed out that the subject who stands before such a world picture seeks not only to grasp that visual version of the world in its bounded entirety, but finds itself as a subject exempt from the world it seeks to know. It does not see itself in the picture. Sometimes we find that conceit operating in the media, and it consoles us by presuming that we are not part of the picture that we see. And yet the effort to grasp the virus in pictorial or graphic terms does not actually secure the immunity of the perceiving subject. We are indeed in the picture that we see, and the distance established is one that denies what it means to be implicated in the phenomenon one seeks to know. Today, however, I am wondering in a tentative way whether the viral world, or the sense of the world given by the virus, is one that pertains to touch and to breathing, to proximity and distance, as it works in invisible ways to produce existential effects. Part of what makes it frightening is that we cannot see it in everyday life without a rather powerful technological instrument. We are left with anxious inference. Do we have it? Where is it? For all those reasons, I'm drawn back to phenomenology, or perhaps compelled to draw it forward in order to understand the phenomenon as exhibiting a sense of world, or a world that is given to us in part through the senses on the occasion of the pandemic. One essay in phenomenology, broadly construed, that I'd like to consider today is On the Phenomenon of the Tragic by Max Scheler, published in German in 1915. That was the same year that Freud published his Reflections on War and Death, the second year of the First World War. I believe these two essays could profitably be read together. The text works in a heterodox way with Husserlian phenomenology, taking distance from those who would center phenomenological analysis in the subject. Husserl had opened up a debate within the field, one that became stronger in the 30s through the 50s, about whether the correlations between the subjective and objective worlds, called noetic and noematic correlates, should emphasize one pole rather than the other. Is there a transcendental subject who constitutes the world from its own a priori structures, or does the world impose itself on our perception in ways that suggest that the ego and the subject are, to some degree, superfluous? Ludwig Landgraber, a Belgian philosopher, wrote in the inaugural issue of Philosophy and Phenomenological Research in 1940 that the subject is the constitutive origin of the world, and that this does not primarily involve a thematization of the world. It's the structure of the world, not so much its theme. So he took, I would say, Husserl in a more Kantian direction, although or brought out the Kantian strain in Husserl. Although we are each born into an already constituted world, phenomenology asks us to bracket that world as we ask about its origins, how it is constituted. The question of the origin of the world is not, for Landgraber, a question of causality, but of constitution, and for that there has to be a horizon. What is worldly, what belongs to the world, appears within a pre-given horizon, but also that which must be constituted as an appearance through a transcendental subjectivity. Landgraber may not have had Scheler in mind, since Sartre had already put forth his proposition to transcend the ego altogether in 1937, and numerous Husserlians were arguing that perhaps there is no transcendental ego or subject, but only what they call a transcendental field. Writing 25 years earlier, Scheler was deeply influenced by Husserl, but decided that his work evacuated objective reality, including objective features of the world. The Scheler essay treats the tragic as a kind of phenomenon, a noematic cluster, as the Husserlians might say, but one that is not primarily constituted by consciousness or acts of projection or interpretation. In that essay, Scheler offers a way to think about the tragic that clearly departs from an Aristotelian understanding of tragic action, according to which the unfolding of a dire set of consequences proceeds according to rules of likelihood and probability. The tragic is not regulated by rules. Oddly, the tragic is not found in the character of a play, nor is it an exclusively aesthetic problem. It neither defines a genre nor a character with a flaw brought down by moral blindness or weakness. Scheler's text surprises with its suggestion that we consider the tragic as a way in which the world exhibits itself. It does not depend upon a play, as I said, or a preconceived idea of genre. The tragic, rather, appears by virtue of human events, and they are events of destruction, as I will explain, but it is not the specificity of the human that it discloses. Rather, it is a feature of the world, one of its qualities. Okay, he writes the following, and I quote, "The tragic is above all a property, ein Merkmal, which we observe in events, fortunes, characters, and the like, and which actually exists in them. We might say that it is given off by them like a heavy breath, okay, like a heavy breath, ein schwerer, kühler Hauch, der von diesen Dingen selbst ausgeht, or seems like an obscure glimmering that surrounds them. In it, a specific feature of the world's makeup appears before us, and not a condition of our own ego, nor its emotions, nor its experience of compassion." Well, if we doubted that this essay could speak to us in pandemic times, consider that in addition to the heavy breath, the tragic depends, Scheler writes, on aerobic emanations that pass through the air, just like the virus, leading one to speculate whether the tragic has a viral character, moves and encircles as a virus does. It is a heavy breath that gives off something, and there are some lingering aerosol traces apparently illuminated by a special kind of light. Although Shaler sought to establish the objectivity of a wide range of phenomena that I don't wish to follow up on because they strike me as implausible, frankly, such as a hierarchy of values that we could say belongs to objective reality, I find it interesting that this term, the tragic, has an objective aura. It happens, it is a category under which certain experiences are gathered. He draws our attention to a relatively simple formulation. It belongs to the category of the tragic. For something to belong to the category of the tragic, some value must be destroyed. I take it that the kind of value destroyed in the tragic is an important one. What is it, and how is it that that set of values is circumscribed? What he tells us is that the tragic is not the same as sadness, that knows and names what it is sad about. When we speak of tragic grief, for instance, in his view, it contains a definite composure, his words, and importantly, tragic grief extends beyond the horizon of the world. It breaks open that horizon. And the breaking open of the horizon is also like a term that Walter Benjamin uses to think about how to reimagine the messianic. And we can go back to that if we wish. The tragic is less a consequence of our own action than the result of something arriving in history, in our lives, and subsequently permeating the soul. Further, the tragic is occasioned by events which come to be understood as tragic events. And yet the tragic is, in his view, never reducible to the event which is its occasion, but persists rather as a kind of atmosphere, geistige Atmosphäre, one in which an uncompromising and inevitable destruction of a value or a set of values takes place. In this way, though the tragic event is an occasion for the tragic, something more is exhibited, namely a set of components that, taken together, constitute the very makeup of the world. It is these, he writes, which, and I quote, make such a thing possible. In other words, the event exhibits something about the world. The event is its occasion, but the world is at once its condition and the phenomenon. The tragic is always concerned with what is individual, singular, but at the same time, the constitution of the world itself. Eine Konstitution der Welt selbst. So it's clearly not the case for Shaler that the world is constituted through a transcendental subject. Rather, on the occasion of great loss and destruction of something or someone valuable, bearing value, we will return to that, the tragic consists not only in the grief over the lost one, but the shock or bewilderment that the world is such that such an event can happen. This is a world in which such an event can happen. Now, my wager is that Shaler names this sense of the tragic residing in the exclamatory fragment with which I started. What kind of world is this in which such a thing can happen? It's not just this event, this loss, or the destruction of this value, but the world in which such a destruction is possible, or perhaps the world in which such a destruction has always been possible without my knowing it, or a world in which such a destruction has become possible without any of us, or at least without my being able to anticipate it. The wager of Shaler's intense anti-subjectivism is that in and through the tragic event, and I quote, "We are directly confronted with a definite condition of the world's makeup without deliberation or any sort of interpretation." Here is the longer version of the argument. This confronts us in the event itself. This is Shaler. It does not result from what it does to the things which brought it about. It is only momentarily connected with the event and is independent of the elements that make it a determined event. The depth is brought about by the fact that its subject is twofold. One is the element of the event that has been seen by us. The other is that point in the world's makeup or constitution that is exemplified by the event and of which the event is but an example. Grief seems to pour out from the event into unlimited space beyond the horizon of the world. It is not a universal, abstract world constitution that would be the same in all tragic events. It is rather a definite individual element of the world's construction, he uses. The remote subject of the tragic is always the world itself, the world taken as a whole, which makes such a thing possible. This world itself seems to be the object immersed in sorrow, end quote. As I read this, the point is precisely not to say, oh, the loss of this or that life is not important, but only the loss of a sense of world in which those events remained unimaginable. Can't we go back? No, it is about the life and the world in which such a life has lived. It is both at once. The sorrow moves between life and world. The event of loss, singular and irreversible, and the world that is now in its unpicturable entirety, right? Something's broken through the horizon, which would have let it be a picture. It can no longer be a picture. The world that is now in its unpicturable entirety is immersed in sorrow. In some ways, this is true insofar as the stories of loss overlap. The cell phone at the hospital, the getting barred at the hospital door, the inability to get to a hospital or to gain admission to see someone in their final days or hours. It refers to this loss and that loss, each very specific losses, and yet as the mode of reference repeats across its occasions, a looming world of loss emerges. Or perhaps its ambient atmosphere becomes, or threatens to become, the air itself, or the very way that the air is registered here and now. We breathe, and that means we are alive in some sense, but if potential and actual grief is in the air that we breathe, then the breath is now the means of passage for the virus and for the grief that sometimes follows, and also surely for the continued living, the breathing of those who survive. So let us return to the questions I raised about Shaler's suggestion with the tragic. A value is destroyed. What is that value? What are those values? Well, one value is touch. The other is breath. Another is the complex surfaces and enclosures of the world, the infrastructure of habitation, but also of an art space, a common space. I am hardly saying anything new when I note that the world of surfaces and the air we breathe should function as supports for life itself, and that under pandemic conditions we come to worry about touch, breath, proximity, loud shouts of joy, dancing too closely. That is a drag, not in the gendered sense. It's a sorrow. It's a kind of perpetual sorrow that afflicts all the joints of sociality. Taking leave of Shaler, I want to ask more about how to live a life under such conditions, and more generally ask about the conditions of a livable life. It is as if the basic requirements for life have been laid bare, and that we become aware of the easier ways of touching and breathing that we perhaps had before. We lose the kinds of proximity that we valued. We do lose touch, both tactility and connection. We recede into regulated boundaries, if we have them, of selfhood and space, of shelter and household, of neighborhood paths, as the value of extra domestic intimacy and sociality is lost, as we, as it were, lose touch across the enforced distances. It is, of course, this or that loved person or this or that kind of gathering that we surely miss, but it is also the constriction of the horizon that delimits what we call the world. So perhaps the problem is not only the one that Shaler specifies as tragic, the world in which such viral threat and destruction is now possible, but also the question of life, of what it means to live as a living creature, a creature among creatures, a life among living processes, under conditions such as these. The restrictions are, of course, occasions for new experimentations, communities of care that are not bound by households, that establish kin beyond the nuclear and normative family, but also the sense that a partially stopped economy has given the environment a chance to renew and repair. Strangers treat each other not only with paranoia, as they do, but also with remarkable solicitude. Social movements like Black Lives Matter take to the streets in masks and apparently act in responsible enough ways so that no spikes in the virus are traced to those impressive and unstoppable movements for social and economic justice. The case for national health care has never seemed stronger where I live. Of course, we are a backward nation in this regard. The case for a guaranteed national income is now more possible than ever. Socialist ideals, quite frankly, have been renewed. And socialism, I would say, not based on any specific historical example, but socialist ideals that move beyond the state instances of socialism that we may know right now. And the movements to abolish prisons and defund the police are no longer crazy pipe dreams, but are openly debated in local councils and regional authorities. And there's also perhaps some mix of grief and solidarity that cross the social and economic lines that so often tend to separate human creatures from one another. Those who insist on denying the death, the loss, the stunning forms of economic and social inequality may well be losing power. Let us hope that with their fading from public life, public power, and visibility, the forces of denial will also be weakened. So I'm suggesting the pandemic conditions also links us, establishes our ties as both precarious and persistent. The metric that tells us which lives are worth safeguarding and which lives are not is pretty clear to see and to impose, as is the metric that establishes acceptable levels of death. Universities and businesses are making this determination, even if they do not always acknowledge that they do. And such decisions target, I would suggest, working people, Black and brown people, the elderly, migrants, those with pre-existing health conditions, the poor, the homeless, those with disabilities, and the incarcerated, including those stalled at the border or subject to overpopulated and unsanitary detention camps. There are new mobilizations, and they appear to be gaining strength in strength and number. But I get ahead of myself because I will focus directly on this in lecture 3 when I talk about social equality, and in lecture 4 where I return to the question of gathering. But to bring this first lecture to a close, I wish to return to this question that I seem unable to stop repeating. What kind of world is this? And link it to two related, if not component, questions. What makes for a livable life? What makes for an inhabitable world. For if we radically question the world in which the destruction of basic values is possible, if that world leads us to a certain line of questioning, it seems to me that one reason we exclaim about the world in that way is that we are not sure how best to live in such a world and what a livable life would be. And we see, perhaps more clearly than before, or in a different way, that the possibility of a livable life depends on an inhabitable world. And in concluding, I wish to think about these two latter questions and see whether Shaler's formulation can help, or whether it meets its limits there. To make a demand for a livable life is to demand that a life has the power to live. If we ask the question, what makes a life livable, we do so precisely because we know that under some conditions, it surely is not livable, that there are unlivable conditions of poverty, incarceration, or destitution by social violence, including homophobic, transphobic, and racist violence, violence against women. Implicit in the question, how long can I live like this, is an assumption that there must be other ways of living, and that we can, or rather must, distinguish between forms of life that are livable and unlivable. But when the question, how can I live like this, becomes a conviction, I will not continue to live like this, we are in the midst of an urgent philosophical and social question. What are the conditions that permit life to be lived in a way that affirms the continuation of life itself? And it is a social question. With whom shall I join my life or connect my life in order to assert the values of our separate, joined lives? These questions are different from what is the good life, or even the existential question, what is the meaning of life? Right? So I'm trying to distinguish those two being established and perfectly good questions, but not the questions here. What I hope to suggest, and as promised in fragmentary form, is that the question of what makes a life livable is linked with the question what makes for an inhabitable world. This last was not Max Shaler's question, but it follows from the world that he describes, the world that he claims is exhibited through the tragic. When the world is an object immersed in sorrow, how is it possible to inhabit such a world? What about the persistence of uninhabitable sorrow? The answer lies less in individual conduct or practice than in the forms of solidarity that emerge across whatever distance to produce the conditions for inhabiting the world together. Am I restoring the place of the subject to the discussion after Shaler has rather emphatically dismissed it? Or am I shifting the discussion to the question of life, of living, and the livable, and not just in the anthropocentric sense of those terms? We have considered the negative wonder, recoil, even shock, not the event as such, but the world in which such a devastating event can happen, a destructive event can happen. But if such an event happens and the world proves to be a place where it can, then how to live in such a world? And how is such a world made livable? This last question is slightly different from the second one I mentioned. What is an inhabitable world? These seem a close cousin to what does it mean to live a livable life, but they are two different questions. The first asserts the world as primary, perhaps in the spirit of Shaler, but it adds the human back into a form of life that is connected to other life forms, such that another question is spawned: how then can the world be inhabited by human and non-human creatures, something to which I will return. The second asserts a distinction between a life that is livable and one that is unlivable, a distinction that actually belongs, I would suggest, more properly to a spectrum. When we speak about the world, we are already speaking about inhabitation. It would be different if we were speaking about the earth. And of course, Hannah Arendt makes an important distinction between earth and world, which we can return to later. I know some of my commentators have deep knowledge of that. Um, the earth persists in many places without being inhabited by humans, but a world is always a space of inhabitation, a time of inhabitation. A world is in some sense the temporal and spatial coordinates in which a life is lived or can be lived. And if the world is uninhabitable, then destruction has had its way with the world. If a life is unlivable, then the conditions of livability have been destroyed. The destruction of the earth through climate change makes for an uninhabitable world. It reminds us of the necessary limits on the human inhabitation of the environment, the fact that we cannot inhabit all of the earth without destroying the earth, and that imposing limits on where and how we live is necessary to preserve the earth, which in turn preserves our lives. Perhaps it sounds simplistic to say, but there are better and worse ways for humans to inhabit the world, and sometimes the earth can only survive and regenerate if limits are set on the reach of human habitation. Humans impose limits imposed on themselves in order to make for a habitable world under conditions of climate change. The world in which one lives includes the earth, depends upon the earth, cannot exist without the earth. Moreover, a life proves not to be livable if the world is not inhabitable. Part of what it means to live, and to live in a way that is livable, is to have a place to live, a part of the earth that can be inhabited without destroying that earth. To have shelter and to be able to dwell as a body in a world that is sustained and safeguarded by the structures and infrastructures in which one lives. To inhabit a world is part of what makes a life livable, so we cannot finally separate the question of an inhabitable world from a livable life. If we as humans inhabit the earth without regard for biodiversity, without stopping climate change, without limiting carbon emissions, then we produce for ourselves an uninhabitable world. The world may not be the same as the earth, but if we destroy the earth, we also destroy our worlds. And if we live human lives with no limits on our freedom, then we enjoy our freedom at the expense of a livable life, sometimes at the expense of life itself. We make our own lives unlivable in the name of our freedom, when freedom is restricted to a notion of unbridled personal liberty that knows no limit and no obligation to others or to the earth. Indeed, and this is a larger discussion, but personal liberty that values itself over all other values can become an instrument by which social bonds and livable worlds are destroyed. Personal liberty, then, under certain conditions, can become a world-destroying power. I'm quite sure this is not a popular view. I'm certainly not against personal liberty. I depend on it for my sexual rights, for my various gender changes and all the rest. Of course, it's my personal liberty, but it's also my social freedom, which is different. The destructive form seems to me to be less about the person or the individual than about a national or global sense of market freedom that takes local instance as personal liberty, and that is continuous with it. There is, I think, another form of freedom that is sidelined by this one, and it emerges in the midst of social life, a life that seeks a common world, a life that is free to seek a common world. And tomorrow, I will take up this issue through returning to Merleau-Ponty in order to understand the vexatious status of common life when thought through the senses, breathing and touching. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Judith. It was wonderful and quite thought-provoking, so to speak. Well, in our the commentators, the people who are attending this lecture, we will start with with commentators. And then if some of the attendees has any question to put, you can use this Zoom platform in order to put your questions. And then if there is some time, we will try to put some of them to Professor Butler. Well, who's first? Please.
I was very interested indeed in your choice of the Shaler text, Judith. I confess I hadn't read it before. I read it today for the first time with great interest. But having listened to you, you went somewhere else with it. I was, in fact, I mean, I'll tell you why in a moment, but I was expecting you maybe to pull back to your early heroine, Antigone, because Antigone, in a way, seems to exemplify the notion of tragedy which could not be otherwise in a heroine, which Shaler is taking as exemplary of his version of tragedy. But what I couldn't quite follow was, and of course we could also reflect that Shaler was writing a piece, completing a piece, which preceded the full rise of National Socialism in Germany, which of course brought him down and stripped him of his position and his even being read as a philosopher of Jewish origin. Had Shaler been writing on the far side of the rise of Nazism, I just wonder whether the notions in the paper, which I'm really glad you asked us to read, might have treated the question of guilt and helplessness differently. Because Shaler On the Tragic, in the essay you asked us to read, has an idea of the tragic which happens when everybody's done their level best. Everybody has acted according to the highest standards. Possibly they're caught in an eternal and irreconcilable clash of great values which brings them down. Whatever, the disaster happens despite, in Shaler's vocabulary, the most noble of efforts. And that means for Shaler that tragedy is essentially guiltless. No guilt can be located in his examples, and tragedy lies beyond judgment. The true tragic deed silences all possible and legal powers of judgment. So we moved into a realm well beyond both human culpability and human efforts at amelioration. And although the hero, as Shaler says, has had a tragic fall, in a hero properly stripped of personal psychology, not a Faustian hero, not a 19th century tragic hero, but I think essentially a Greek hero, Oedipus, or indeed your own Judith, your own Antigone. The hero will find himself labeled by guilt, but actually what Shaler says is that it's his own purity of will that has made him be seen as somebody who, despite his best endeavors, has fallen into guilt. And so he has ended up, and it is a he in Shaler, he has ended up with what Shaler calls unguilty guilt. And this whole exposition of guilt and the degree to which, for Shaler, tragedy lies in an unworldly sphere well beyond the reach of worldly judgment. I wondered how that finds a home, so to speak, or finds some kind of neighborliness with your own much more profoundly hope-filled address to questions of responsibility.
Well, thank you very much, Denise. First of all, someone in the chat suggests that my face has not been visible. Is this true?
No, not for us.
No, you have seen my face.
No.
Okay, good. Not that I love my face, it's rather that it is an obligation to show the face under such conditions. Okay. Well, Denise, you're very right. I mean, I think that I decided to take what I wanted, quite frankly, from the Shaler, because there are many things about the Shaler that I find very problematic.
Yeah, sure.
And we're also living in a time when people say, don't read Shaler, or don't even cite Heidegger once in your talk. And yet, you know, it is part of my formation and way of thinking. And I easily and fiercely condemn Heidegger's Nazism, but will take his useful remarks on the world picture if I think they are useful. So so that's tricky. But look, I think that it is true. This moving beyond the worldly horizon is there throughout, and this idea of breaking open the horizon, or a kind, or perhaps even a sense of the tragic, or a sense of guilt that moves beyond, is crucial. What that is for him is perhaps less interesting to me than the limit on anthropocentric guilt, or that is to say, a kind of guilt that solidifies anthropocentrism. Mm-hmm. Right? Whatever happens that is devastating is to be faulted to the human. The human made this world, and now we suffer its consequences. Now we can say that about the virus, and there are people who have, in fact, you know, believe that we can look at animal markets and the history of that kind of profiting to show how something like this can happen, and we hold ourselves accountable to it. And that particular causal scheme makes a lot of sense, and I read those histories, and I'm persuaded in large part by what is said. And yet, the sense of loss and the devastation itself can't be immediately converted into that kind of guilt without recentering the human in the middle of its world, when actually what the virus is also showing or telling us, if we can speak that way, is that we are kind of interconnected in ways that do not necessarily put the human in the center, or ought not put the human in the center, because certainly part of the destruction of environments, including the destruction of animals, follows from this anthropocentrism, which gives both full power and full guilt to the human, and keeps it encapsulated in a kind of narcissistic clench or lock. So it's the opening up beyond that narcissism and that anthropocentric moment, which I think is terribly important, and that might be the unguilty part of the guilt, right? That this also this happens to others and not just to me. I don't indict humanity for bringing about this. It's humanity that is being destroyed. You know, we can look at processes without then suddenly deciding that humans, or generalizing and saying humans are the cause of all destructiveness. I had to review a paper recently in which this young man, and I felt for him. It was beautiful. He really and truly believes that if we got to the right social organization of the world, there would be no suffering. And I thought, that is incredible. Someone still believes that. I don't believe that. And I don't know if that makes me existentialist or religious or somebody who believes in something about the human condition or the human creaturely condition, but I don't think that that is the case. And so yes, there is that limit there, and I'm glad you bring that up. I think one could go more deeply into the Shaler for that reason. I suppose I am folding Shaler, maybe illegitimately, but I'm folding Shaler into another kind of framework, and as I will be folding the phenomenological theories I'm looking at into a framework that is also has political dimensions to it, trying to rethink the social inequality of life, the ways in which certain populations get tracked for death, the possibilities for renewal and repair that lie before us, given the devastations that are now increasingly plain to see. I will, for instance, take the question of the value of human life, not in a Shaler. I take his question, but I don't take the answer in the direction that he would have me go. I think there are limits to his reflection. That said, I am very interested in the fact that the debates within phenomenology on whether the transcendental subject should be primary, Landgräber, working publishing in 1940, is in the midst of this war, right? Saying it is the transcendental subject, right? And distinguishing between our pre-philosophical understandings of the world and a philosophical understanding of the world. So seeking, a very radical power for human subjectivity to constitute the world in a rational philosophical way. And Shaler evacuating that in order to register destruction in a different way that does not put the human at the center. I think, I'm not a sociologist of philosophy, so I don't really know how to think about it, but I do believe that they were both reacting to some degree to wars that they were living through, and that it might be able to see some of the tensions within phenomenology on the question of the subject. I mean, brutal arguments in the 30s and 40s and 50s, including those which my own dissertation advisor engaged in, whether there was a subject, whether there was an ego, maybe it's just a field. In any case, thank you for your remark.
Thanks.
Thanks, Judith, for your wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you or share with you some thoughts. Perhaps it will be a link between today's session and tomorrow's, because it has also to do with Merleau-Ponty's perspectives. I did some research on that many years ago, and when I wrote my book, A Common World, what interested me in Merleau-Ponty about this notion was that his philosophy made it possible to understand this notion of a common world, not as an aspiration concept, not as an ideal or aspirational notion, but as an embodied situation. We are already in a common world, even if this common is not an egalitarian, harmonical idea of a shared world. What is common is to be here in conditions that we can perceive as not good or as not right or as not desirable. It depends on how do we see them, on how do we perceive them, but the common is already there as an embodied situation. So what are the consequences of thinking about ourselves from that situation, not towards that ideal notion of common? I think it's a very powerful change and turn of the point of view of that subject, that is not a subject anymore in front of the world, is that liberal fiction of the ego and the alter ego, the ego and the subject and the object, etc., metaphysical, and then in its liberal also evolution. And now I think that many of the discourses that the pandemic situation have mobilized in a way are going again towards a new idealistic idea of the common world, because it makes many voices that I hear are making abstraction of this embodied situation and making the pandemic like a new universal condition of the human being, exposed and not perceiving, but being like in a religious revelation of its vulnerability. And here I wanted to come to the question. Don't you think that the way the concept of vulnerability is being more and more used is very useful to this kind of new idealistic and universalistic positions that neutralize and erase precisely this kind of tragic situation that you were trying to point us today? I think when we hear people saying we have discovered that we are all vulnerable, this notion of vulnerability becomes like an abstract, generic attribute that doesn't allow to think not only the real, but the embodied engagements that vulnerability, understood as a common situation, not as an abstract attribute, obliges us to, or allows us to think. What do you think about that? Do you feel is happening what I'm saying? How do we deal with that displacement of notions? And how can we jump into this idea of common world as a situation and not as an idealistic aspiration and more moralistic aspiration?
Thank you, Marina. Of course, I'm very mindful of your book and on the common world, and I read it quite happily. And this is, I guess, what I have to say to you is something which I think you already know and maybe formulate better than I do, which is that I think there is a way to point to something common, shared. I don't know if I can say it's universal, but there is a way to point to that aspiration without effacing the specificities of vulnerability and loss and affliction that people are dealing with. Because, and the reason I would say this is because of the networks, which I'll talk about in lecture 4, which involve cross-regional solidarities and forms of activist translation that try to understand what those specificities are and also to lend support and relay communication and solidarity over those distances. The kinds of activism that I'm seeing, for instance, are ones that do rely on platforms such as these and other social media platforms that do establish solidarities and forms of communication that don't depend on being located in the same place together. So some of our ideas of grassroots politics depend on being assembled or gathered in neighborhoods and site-specific areas. And whereas I think that is still happening in the mutual aid societies and the communities of care at local levels, and in protests or in planned actions, there's also a kind of global mindfulness, which is not the pushing of an abstraction across the digital airwaves at the expense of specificity. It's actually getting more knowledge, right? It's getting more knowledge, getting more understanding of what's happening elsewhere and how that works, so that what is similar and what is very, very different can be acknowledged. So I guess I see it as more of a kind of rhythm, not exactly a dialectic, but I see it as a rhythm between the local and the global, maybe even the local, regional, linguistically common, extra-linguistic, globally at a distance. I see these kinds of discourses and movements happening. I do agree with you that if we move, it's like moving to all lives matter too quickly. Even though, yes, all lives matter. We think all lives matter, or they should matter. But if we allow it to become a kind of descriptive conviction, all lives matter, then we fail to understand that there are conditions under which some lives are mattering and other lives are not, and we erase the inequality. So how to handle that is important. And I agree with you that it would be terrible if vulnerability, even solidarity, or common world discourse became an abstraction that leveled those differences or effaced those differences, right? Inequality and effacement, both being, as we know, real quite dire consequences of that kind of universalization and abstraction. On the other hand, I guess I would defend the aspirational dimension. Like what would it mean to search for, to aspire to a common world in which those connections could be made that did not efface the specificity and the situated character of those who are part of that. I think that is the problem, right? Because when you make reference to uh, um, Merleau-Ponty, it seems to me that the idea of situation, or of a situated embodiment or a situated agency is terribly important, and that we cannot take people out of their situation. And I agree. But what would it mean to be situated and aspirational, and not to forfeit either? So I suppose I'm pushing in those two directions. We'll see whether I can do that. I can't do it alone, and I can't do it alone in thought. It has to unfold in the world in some way. But I'm trying to describe some movement that I think I see, and we'll see whether that is correct.
Thank you, Judith, for that kind of wonderfully eloquent reflection on kind of how we register the pandemic. I was reminded by how Mike Davis describes the discovery and the naming of the coronavirus in the new kind of preface to Monster on the influenza. He describes how it was likened to the astronomical phenomena of the corona. And I thought that was very kind of thought-provoking, in that, in a way, the corona allows us to see the condition of seeing. So the eclipse of the sun allows us to see the sun and imagine kind of what we can't normally see with the sun. And it also allows us to kind of imagine this shadow of the virus kind of crossing the earth, placing some in darkness, leaving some in light, but leaving nobody, nobody free from being touched by that shadow. And it led me also to think, and maybe to question you, how far you would extend the bounds of kind of valuable life or valued life. because in a sense, another, something else that the coronavirus has allowed us to see is kind of quite how much life there is apart from our life, and kind of how closely we are kind of dependent on it. I was always very struck by kind of Mancuso's book Brilliant Green, where he describes humanity as a trace element of the plant. We make up less than a fraction of a % of the planet's biomass, and in a way, we are the the guests of the plants. They are nutrition. They give us the air that we breathe. And I was wondering kind of how far so we could understand that broader kind of understanding of kind of plants have been calling for a, and that I think takes me to the question that was kind of preoccupying kind of you, Shayla, which is what kind of world is this? I wonder whether it wouldn't be a kind of a valuable approach to an answer to that question, is to say we don't know, but maybe it's not ours, and that we can perhaps live better and survive even if we depart from the assumption that we are kind of we have a very, very tenuous hold on life on this planet. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Howard. I really appreciate that contribution. I think that the short answer is to say I'm willing to go very far, and that I find it extremely interesting that we're having to think climate destruction and the pandemic at the same time, and to reconsider our practices and our institutions and our industries from the ground up. I drove up the coast of California yesterday to sequester myself to prepare these lectures, but I drove past several areas that were burned, and I'm very mindful that these sorts of horrendous fires are predicted to increase, and the living world that is destroyed includes human life and villages and towns, but it's also clearly massive numbers of trees and landscapes that are now altered and getting ready for mudslides when the rain comes, because the roots have been destroyed, and they were the defenses against erosion, right? So it's the destruction that one is fathoming is not just the destruction of human life, but the living conditions and the inhabitable earth. I will. I do think that maybe I appreciate very much the suggestion that maybe humanity is a trace element of the plants. I think that's kind of great. We definitely need to become smaller and live with greater humility, and perhaps also accept the limits of what we can know. Sometimes our questions assume the right to know, or an omnipotent power of thought. Like, we need answers, we need to answer so that we can think through properly and fully. And it may be that living with the limit of the thinkable is about living with the limits of ourselves. At the same time, I would say, precisely to combat climate change and its destruction, we can't just make ourselves small. We actually have to think very hard about practices of renewal and repair, which go, I think, beyond stewardship as a model. So our thinking capacities have to be put to good use to repair, renew the earth and world, and to recognize their the ineluctable character of that connection. I mean, I almost think that the perspective of the planetary, although it's used for other reasons, geopolitical ones as well, calling into question the maps of the world and even the pictures of the world, it is a perspective, perhaps an astronomical one, to follow on Mike Davis's research, an astronomical one that allows us to see Earth and world, yes, as where we are situated, but also where how the relationship between those two work. So it's an almost radically unsituated or dislocated perspective that comes to inform the way we are situated and how we live, the practices of our life. So it's, again, perhaps not an abstraction, but a point of view that we can invoke or entertain that allows us to take a different kind of understanding of our history and our place to combat some of the harsher consequences of a terrible anthropocentrism. I cannot yet hear you.
No? 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 Okay. Okay, good. Got it. Okay. Well, I was saying just thank you for this inspiring talk, and also for inviting us to read Shella. I hadn't read this text either, and it was very, very well. It made a great impact. So what I sort of trace in the whole text by Shella is this kind of flaw in the symbolic tools or symbolic framework that we as humans believe to be in possession of, in order to answer questions like the one you asked, for instance. You said, what kind of world is this? And departing from Shella's text and his elaboration of the tragic, I believe that the first thing we can do with this question is to acknowledge that it is impossible to answer, that the world as it is in its tragic structure resists it. So it is as if, because of this tragic structure, the world sort of is given this viral consistency. The virus, as we know, also resists, and it mutates, and it has all the effects it has in our bodies due to this capacity, structural capacity of resistance. The world, as the virus, resists to be brought into intelligible terms, as it were. It cannot be, the question, what kind of world is this, cannot be simply answered. So the world, in a way, understood in the terms that Shella uses, no? He speaks of the inflexibility of reality. We also have this experience of the inflexibility of reality these days. This is what we mostly have. Due to this inflexibility of reality, the world resists the bracket operation that phenomenology consists of, precisely. It breaks out those brackets all the time, and rather puts life between brackets, or at least what we understand by life, all the tools that we have to make it make sense, right? So interpretation is brought into brackets as the main human operation that also explains and justifies commonality as a human device, as it were, as a human apparatus, as a human way of just being in this world, inhabiting this world, living lives. Also, that is put into brackets. Even commonality is put into brackets. This is one aspect of the text by Sheila that I wanted to share with you, taking into account the question that you made. You know, what kind of world is this? The other one brings us back to what Denise took on in the beginning, with this feature of the guiltless guilt that Sheila speaks about. This guiltless guilt, in my understanding, is also a feature of this inflexibility of reality, also speaks of this inflexibility of reality, and of the limits of the symbolic tools and frameworks that we have. The way that Sheila has to develop this guiltless guilt is by saying the tragic happens. It is not due to a free act that the tragic happens. The tragic happens despite any freedom of action or any freedom of will. It just happens. Well, COVID-19 happens as well. It follows the same pattern. But not only that, there are only features in our shared, I would say, shared world, despite everything. Blackness happens. Poverty happens. Inequality happens. Maybe if we think of Angela Davis' abolitionist position towards prisons, we could also maybe be as extreme as to affirm that criminality happens. Just trying to bring it to a very extreme point. Yeah, I would like to know what you think about that, about this, what we can make about this tragic happens, you know, how to relate to that. You know? Especially if we think of, we could maybe bring all these affirmations to a single one, saying that inequality happens. You know, what do we make about that when we try to answer the question, what kind of world is this where inequality happens? What can we do about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Begonia. Such a large and important set of questions. I almost feel that if I were in your classroom, I would ask for a couple of months to write a paper in reply. I would ask for an extension, is what I would do. I would ask for an extension.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Let's write the paper.
But no, thank you. Let me, well, first of all, I mean, I don't answer the question. I only repose the question. And I repose it so many times that it actually becomes something of a rhetorical embarrassment in my text. And I think it may be the case that I stage the question time and again, precisely because it cannot be answered, and yet it is a cry or an exclamation or a modality of what I'm calling negative wonder, a kind of, you know, shock that emerges, and it emerges in many areas of life and in many forms, right? It's perhaps it is a form of cry that takes the propositional form of a question. And maybe also it is a question precisely because it is repeated so often with that does not have an answer and does not exactly expect one, but in its unanswerability exhibits the limits of what we can know, right? So it wouldn't be a matter of retracting the question or doing away with the question. It would be a matter of letting the question stand again and again, unopened, unanswerable, almost like a cry to the gods or a prayer on the part of the secular or whatever, what's left of prayer within the secular. Or maybe a lamentation. Maybe it belongs properly to the sphere of lamentation. I'm not sure. But I would perhaps say that there is a limit on intelligibility that we suffer, and maybe we suffer it to a degree. Maybe putting Howard's remarks and Denise's together, maybe we suffer or register the limits of intelligibility, as Begonia says, as guiltless guilt, or maybe we're more guilty in some because of our practices and complicity, and in other cases, ineffably guilty, right? Guilty in an emphatically guiltless way, and so how to describe those variations, I'm not sure. You know, it is true that for Husserl, obviously, and for many of his immediate followers, there's the phenomenological reduction, and then there is the epoche, two different stages, both of which are meant to put out of play our everyday understanding, our everyday beliefs about our world in order for that world and the ways of understanding to come to the fore as objects of phenomenological analysis. And that's those bracketing exercises, as it were, although they are distinct, are the result of deliberate philosophical practices. But I think that it may be, and I think both Sartre and Merleau-Ponty suggest this, and I will mention it in the third lecture. Sartre and Merleau-Ponty both had the sense that actually there are events from the world that put us into a situation where the world itself becomes a question. And I think Shaler was saying that we get forced into the bracketing. We get forced into a kind of epoche. There are forms of disorientation or loss that allow the question of, like, what's the world again, or what kind of world is this, or how is the world constituted? In other words, it emerges, I would say, well, for Sartre, it emerges existentially. For Shaler, it seems to me that it's emerging situationally, or on the basis of an event, of an event of destruction. So we might be able to recuperate the notion of bracketing within a different kind of phenomenological description. All right, we're suddenly pushed into the brackets, or we find ourselves living in a bracketed way. Like, what is the world? So I think you know, it is. I think there is a political edge that we are walking here. If we say criminality happens, well, what about the sociology of crime? What is actually called criminal? What happens when political protest is called criminal? What happens if Black people are assumed to be criminals even when they haven't done anything? Right. So it's not exactly. I think it's not exactly the same as the tragic. It is true that such practices and institutions happen and rehappen, and they produce a world with devastating consequences. But I wouldn't want to lose the capacity to do the historical or political work to understand that. I mean, much like Angela's work on prison. On prison abolition, and yet there's a quality of these acts of violence that do that do make us wonder. And here I would say, how is it a certain version of the world gets naturalized or normalized? And why shouldn't we put it into question and say, how did the world get constituted in such a way that this is now accepted as the world? And sometimes then the disorientation from the world allows us to call into question certain modes through which the world is constituted, right? I mean, I remember visiting Mexico, and I'm sure you have stories that are similar, where trying to talk to a journalist to talk about rape as a sexual crime, and this journalist was like, "Well, no, it's not a crime." It's like, and I just thought, oh, this person has not linked his idea of what a crime is with rape as a crime. Like the idea of rape had to be built up in his mind. It had to be kind of I don't know how to put it. I didn't inculcate it, but I had to explain why it is a crime and build a kind of concept of the sexual crime. For somebody who was living in a world in which, yes, rape happens and the death of women happens, it's too bad, but it's part of life. And I was like, no, we must shake up that world in which that is a naturalized understanding, right? So that would be like an example where I would want to be part of the disruption of that particular world constitution, right? And ask for a critical reorientation towards that form of naturalization. I don't know if we are at the end of our hour. I realize we've been going for almost 2 hours, and
Yes, actually, we are kind of running out of time. It's this small world, the small world we are creating all together has in principle a 2-hour duration. That's what we said of the beginning. So, and there are some questions there from the people. Judith, if you go to questions and answers, you can see them. And I was about to ask you there are two possibilities: either to read them a little bit quicker, or that I would propose that I send them to you in order for you, for example, to read them calmly. And for example, tomorrow, if you deem it appropriate, then you give an answer to some of these questions in order for these people to have some kind of answer from you. Now it's a little bit late. So yeah. How about this second possibility?
Yes, send me the questions, please. And I look forward to reading them and thinking about them, and I will prepare some answers for tomorrow.
Freely, feel free. So if tomorrow you feel like giving an answer to some of these questions, not all of them, then please you could do that, and the people then would feel in a sense there. They have been there, although we could not see them, but there have been some 100 people there attending this session. We welcome you tomorrow again. Thank you very much to all of you. This is a small wall we are creating this time, and see you tomorrow, same hour, more enthusiasm.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
See you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.